Hey, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us here at the Downtown Council for a critically important virtual program on the journey to cultural competence. We're just going to give it a minute or two to let other people join, and we'll get right on with our program. So bear with us, and in the meantime, if you want to introduce yourself in the chat function, we'll know who's joining us this morning. So we'll be right back to you. Well, again, good morning. I'm Steve Kramer. I'm the president and CEO of the Minneapolis Downtown Council, and delighted that folks are able to join us this morning for this video conference on a really important issue, Journey to Cultural Competence. This is another in a series of member programs that the Downtown Council has sponsored, really listening to our important leaders of color in our downtown community as we all work to move forward as a community in the aftermath of the events of Memorial Day and the killing of George Floyd and all the things that we're working on to make our community better for everyone. So thanks for being a part of this dialogue. There are a lot of things going on downtown right now. Certainly the impact of COVID on the economy is still noticeable, and I think that recovery is coming. It's going to be a little bit slow. Obviously debates about public safety and the right approach to that important issue continue in our community, and our organization is engaged in all of that as we look to probably 2021 as a year when we can really anticipate a reanimated downtown economy and welcoming more people back to offices and restaurants and sporting events and theater and all the things that make downtown vital and important for our whole city and our whole region. So thanks for being a part of that effort as well, and we'll look forward to future weeks and months as that recovery continues. As I mentioned, today is a really critical conversation. Looking forward to it. We have a great panel that will be moderated by my colleague, Dan Collison. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Beth Weisberg, our membership director, and give a few tips about these webinars that we've been having. Mary Beth? Mary Beth, you're muted.
I just got that. Thanks, Steve, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I just wanted to mention a few housekeeping items. First of all, we're all really at the mercy of our technology and our Wi-Fi connections, so we really appreciate your patience and bearing with us should we experience any technical difficulties. This conversation will be recorded, and it will be placed on our YouTube channel for later viewing and sharing with anybody that you'd like to send a link to. We will be sending the link out to everybody who registered and also everybody who's on our newsletter email distribution list. If you have questions that you as we kick off the program, do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat function, so you can know who's here and make connections. And then if you have any questions that you would like answered by the panelists at the end of the presentation, please use the Q&A function. It's easier for us to track that than the chat function. And then we'll answer as many of your questions as possible at the end of the program. Now I'm going to hand it back to Steve to share information about some upcoming programs.
Great. Thanks, Mary Beth. We have a slide on our Gala to share.
We don't have a slide for it. You can just talk about it.
All right. We have our Downtown Council Gala every fall is usually an in-person event, of course, and not so much this year. So on October 8th at 5 o'clock, we'll have a virtual gala where we'll talk about kind of the state of downtown and have a little bit of panel conversation and a few videos as well. So I hope you can join us for that. That invitation has gone out or will be going out shortly, and you can also find out more about that program and other upcoming events for the balance of this year, all of which will be virtual at our website, which is mplsdowntown.com. So hopefully you can join us on the 8th of October, as well as future events that we have scheduled for 2020. And with that, as I mentioned, I'm going to turn this program over to my colleague, Dan Collison, who is our Director of Downtown Partnerships and also the Executive Director of the East Town Business Partnership and the New Loop Partners, among other things. So Dan, take it away into this really important conversation.
Great. Thank you, Steve, and thank you to the Downtown Council staff, and thank you to everyone who's on today's webinar. And I invite you, if you find this content helpful for you and helpful for your company, that you share the YouTube link after this is published and after it's over. There's going to be, I think, some really invaluable content. Let me back up real quick just to frame the background behind this webinar. Well over a year ago, nearly 100 leaders across sector came together at the YMCA Equity Innovation Center, partnered with the Downtown Council to do a year-long think tank about how downtown could become more inclusive. And that resulted in a very simple but straightforward report, and more importantly, a big set of commitments to help downtown become more inclusive. And so an outflow of that is we now have an inclusive downtown action group. And I would be pleased to connect with any of you who are listening to this or watching this. If you want to get involved with the various work groups, reach out to me. And I would be pleased to see what group might be a fit for you. For the purpose of today's forum, this is now the third in the series of listening to our leaders of color. And I have a privilege of convening a roundtable of executive practitioners in the diversity, equity, inclusion space. Very meaningful conversations. They mentor me as a white, cisgendered, straight man in the workforce and in the professional downtown space. They're exceptional. And today's group that we have, the panel, are people that are at the very top of their field and have a lot of wonderful content to present, but also are incredible people, incredible leaders. And so let me just let you know their names and their positions, and then we will dig into their stories and their work, and then even deeper dive into how they engage in today's topic, the journey of cultural competency for professionals and for companies. Shemaine Brayman is the Senior Manager of Culture, Diversity, and Inclusion at Target Corporation. Tanya Palmer is the Director, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion for Hennepin County, and yes, that's the whole county. And then Ramon Pastrano is, Dr. Ramon Pastrano is the President and CEO of Impact Lives, and he does executive coaching and a number of things that he'll share with in a moment. So thank you, Shemaine and Tanya and Dr. Ramon. It is a thrill to have you in the webinar. It's a thrill to have you as colleagues and friends. So thank you for taking the time. Let's do a quick lightning round first and just kind of set up and frame who you are in relationship to your work. So let's start with Shemaine. What's your personal and professional journey into your current leadership role?
Well, thank you, Dan, Steve, and Mary Beth, so much for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. And I love that question of personal and professional journey into this work, because I will start by sharing a little bit about my personal background. It's relevant backdrop, I think, for today's conversation. So I am an immigrant, was born in Guyana and moved to the United States when I was about 4 years old. Jersey girl through and through. I grew up in New Jersey, in Newark, New Jersey, actually. And at the time that I was growing up, the rate of graduation for students in Newark public schools was about 7%. And so to combat those odds, my mom enrolled me in a prep school many towns away, where students were very different from me racially and socioeconomically. I was one of very few Black students in the school that I attended. And I share that because while it seems like I'm going very far back into my backdrop for this introduction, I do think that navigating my West Indian family, my Black African-American community, and a predominantly white education system was perhaps my first introduction to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and a realization at a very young age just how far apart many of our communities truly are, and the work that we have ahead of us as we think about the context of today's conversation. But fast forwarding, I began my career in education, where I actually returned to Newark as a Teach for America Corps member and taught in Newark, New Jersey for a few years. And it was during this time that I found myself more interested in the equity experiences of not only our students, but also our teachers of color, than I was necessarily in some of the lessons that I was planning, while certainly there was passion there as well. And so when my husband's career brought us to the Twin Cities, I decided to really pursue that work as diversity and inclusion work primarily. And so prior to my current role at Target, I was the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Health Partners, where I was responsible for setting the strategy and leading the execution of our diversity and inclusion priorities. And in my current role at Target, I have responsibility for leading our headquarters and global diversity and inclusion work, and really partnering with our business and HR leaders to help build out strategies that advance our D&I goals for our team members and strengthen the inclusion acumen of our leaders, as well as supporting the teams that ensure that our products and our assortments are really inclusive of the diverse guests that we serve. And I think the time that we're in currently really highlights that more than ever. So really glad to be here. Looking forward to today's discussion, and thank you for having me join the conversation today.
Thanks so much, Shemaine. I love that you sort of follow the flow that brings you to your chair through education. That's a powerful narrative. Tanya, let's turn to you. Like, what's your personal and professional journey into your current role?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. I was born in Chicago, Illinois. I grew up as a South Side Chicago child, but like Shemaine, I started noticing diversity, equity at a very young age, having an African-American mother and an Italian father. I started noticing differences in our family right away, stares, people asking questions. So as we moved to Minnesota, the culture was very different from living in Chicago, and so I noticed that as well. I have to give my father a lot of credit. He told me I had to grow up to be a strong Black woman, and the education through my mother and father really helped me on my journey. So when I started working at the county, and it's been 28 years now, one of the things that I noticed is that they didn't have a lot of diversity training. So I started in my spare time just writing diversity curriculum. I started teaching it, and then I was asked to do it countywide, and so it just grew from there. And so now we're at the point in the county where it is a priority to reduce disparities in the county. And a little bit later, I'll talk about how we're trying to reduce disparities in Hennepin County through the 7 domains that we are working on. So I'll leave it there, Dan, but thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Tanya, for sharing that. And again, how the journey to your role is not a straight line. It's sort of a windy one that brings you to this focus of passion and leadership. Dr. Ramon Pastrano, bring us into your story and share with us a little bit about your journey to the current role you're in.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Let me first say thank you, Steve, Mary Beth, and Dana for putting this group together. Yeah, so my journey began back in what I call the Emerald Field, aka the sugarcane fields of the Dominican Republic. And via Puerto Rico, I came to the United States as a 16-year-old, studying college, and I came here by myself. Didn't speak a word of English, but I don't know, I just have a drive that I wanted to become the best version of myself. I chose a school in the Midwest because I didn't want to be exposed to people who spoke, same languages that I spoke, especially in the West Coast or the East Coast. So I chose Iowa. The challenge, with Iowa was the lack of cultural diversity and diversity of dimensions of many kinds. That was for the first time where I experienced, systemic, racism, both at the macroaggression level and the microaggression level. But that did not deter me at that time. I continued through my journey, became a United States naval officer back in 1986. And it was during that time with the US Navy traveling to the Far East and getting to immerse myself into different cultures that I became more interested in this concept of cultural differences. After working, spending about 6 years in the Navy, I went to work in the medical field as a surgical consultant for a couple of medical device company and a pharmaceutical company. And then after that, I got this urge and this passion about people and the problem that people were facing. I didn't know exactly how to approach that. And soon I found myself working on my doctorate, which was discovering the process of human transformation and system transformation. And that journey took me to the Middle East, to Palestine, Israel, Jordan, India, and then to Southeast Asia. And from that moment on, I started realizing that, bridging these cultural differences were, critical, for not only for leadership, but also for us as a society. So it was during that time that this idea of impact lives began to, emerge in my head. And I ended up founding Impact Lives as a center for transformational leadership, social innovation, cultural competence, and equity and inclusion. And my primary focus was awareness-based leadership and critical thinking. So my personal mission was to assist individuals and organizations in developing innovative framework to address their most pressing challenges. So one of my biggest mistakes that I made was that I approached this work with the idea of trying to change the conditions around people. And what I realized right away was that my job was not to change the conditions, that were affecting people, but it was more about changing people or helping people transform their mindset so that they can change the conditions around themselves. So my approach to this work is multidisciplinary and integrate sciences, medicine, business, faith, sociocultural anthropology, and profound social change methodologies.
Thank you, Dr. Pastrano. That idea of the work being inside out is one of these, I think, profound but important. It's not a secret. It's like an open secret, but ultimately invites us to a lot deeper and longer term change than just flicking switches and assuming it'll be one and done, which can sometimes be what we want to do in the marketplace. Well, I just want to highlight as we now go into another round of presentation, if you have questions, we will have a Q&A time at the end. I would love to receive your questions. You can send them to the panelists if you want, or send them just in the chat feature, because we're now going to really dive deep into this journey of cultural competency as these professionals coach, lead, and shape the culture of their companies, and in Dr. Pastrano's case, a lot of executive leaders. So pivoting back to Shemaine, now let's go deep. How would you describe your company's overall framework for helping its employees move along a pathway of greater cultural competency? And based on some of our pre-conversation, I'd love to draw you out a little bit on allyship and how that works out. Because again, and this is for everyone's sake, after the killing of George Floyd, we had a roundtable of practitioners, and I asked them, like, what is it that white leaders should be doing right now? And ultimately they said, talk to white leaders about becoming, and then we had this nice list of things that were important to work on, and that is all about allyship if you are a white leader. And so Shemaine, bring us into that space and take us deep into this larger question or set of questions.
Absolutely. I'll start a little bit first by backing up and offering high-level overview how we've been thinking about sort of this question of moving folks along in the journey. So first and foremost, we always start with our purpose, and at Target, that purpose really is to help all families discover the joy of everyday life. And we as an organization have really been leaning into that idea of all families and how we ensure that as we're thinking about that, we understand not only what joy looks like across a variety of different dimensions of difference, but also what are the ways in which perhaps the retail industry may not be contributing to those positive experiences for various guests, and how we partner and work to build assortments and experiences that really help fill in those gaps. As we're grounded in that purpose, as we think about moving folks along in the journey, we really try to take an ecosystem approach. So we expect that this is not the work of just a chief diversity officer or just the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, but really this is the work of leaders, how they build diverse and inclusive teams, how they design equitable business practices, and how they think about the ways in which equity and inclusion show up in the work. And we at Target, we always say that everyone has a role to play, and it's not the same role, but it's the role that you're best positioned to play. So as a component of cultural competency and bringing folks along, we really try to help leaders identify what's the role that you are uniquely positioned to play, and then how do we help you develop the acumen and the skills necessary in order to most effectively play that role. And then finally, we really try to anchor our work in guardrails that help equip our teams to practice empathy and inclusion and strengthen their inclusion acumen. I think, Dan, to your question specifically around allyship, what we're learning is that this work is continually evolving, and even perhaps the way that we might have thought about traditional approaches to diversity and inclusion, the murder of George Floyd and many others is really causing us to have to ask questions about different ways of approaching that work and different ways of engaging in those conversations. And I think allyship is a prime example of that. I recently read a Lean-In report that showed that over, and granted this was a report that was specific to the experiences of Black women, but the report had a stat that has stayed with me, which is that over 80% of white men and women see themselves as allies in the workplace. When you ask Black women how they feel, the extent to which they feel that Black women have allies in the workplace, that number drops to about 26%. And I think that this data, this little data point is really interesting because it's telling in terms of where our organizations are as it relates to cultural competency. We know hearts and minds are in the right place, and allyship is certainly a component of that. But as we think about things like allyship, how do we make sure that we're not centering what necessarily feels good to the dominant culture, but instead really centering the needs and experiences of those who are most impacted by inequities in our workplace. And so I think allyship is one of those aspects of the conversation that really is continuing to be refined as we think about moving away from allyship that is performative or allyship that is really about wearing that badge and feeling good versus allyship that digs deep and does the work perhaps when no one is looking or no one is aware of the ways in which you might be showing up for communities that otherwise wouldn't have access. So we're on the journey of those conversations for ourselves as the D&I team, as well as for our broader organization as we think about how we engage more deeply in that kind of dialogue.
Thank you for that. And I'm especially reflecting on that notion of non-performative allyship. I mean, I know that, again, I have this nickname, Get Her Done Dan. Like, I'm someone who just loves to like move into that, I'm going to get an A lane and we're going to get this done. And, you know, that whole vein of like, let's charge ahead. And ultimately, this is very deeply human. This is very deeply connective to one another. And because there's a lot of blind spots that I know I have as a white person, that I can all too easily fall into that performative allyship and have to really think it through at a deeper level. That's a really powerful construct and challenge. Pivoting to Tanya. Tanya, so you have been overseeing diversity, equity, inclusion training for the entire county for nearly 15 years. And bring us into the training and how it's changed over the years. I'll just say for everyone on the call here, as Director of Downtown Partnerships, I mean, I'm a curious soul, but because I'm Executive Director for a partner business associations, I love dropping in on like training sessions and understanding how companies and organizations equip employees. So I've had the privilege of going through Tanya's training, and I think she's got a newer version I'm going to go through, and I'm going to drop into that for like a half-day training. And it's incredible what she has done and what Hennepin County is doing. Bring us into that space. How do you train 7,000 employees that work across so many different disciplines for the public through the county lens? Bring us into that world.
Thank you, Dan. So I'll start out by talking about, we have in the last few years got a new business line at Hennepin County, and that business line is called Disparities Reduction. And the line of business in that department provide direction and strategy to facilitate system change that eliminate disparities and advance equity in the communities, right? So we wanted to make sure that the people who are serving the community understood what they were doing, which meant our employees. So therefore, we had to start thinking about stages of education for our employees. So we started out a few years ago with some general education on diversity and inclusion. And as I was thinking about it, I said, we really need to teach people about these words that folks say so often, right? So they say DEI, or they say diversity and inclusion, or they say diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I thought, you know, here we are saying these words and they mean so much, but yet people really didn't understand what they meant. And so we started our education by talking about what diversity really is. And so we spent about a year talking about diversity and what that means to each individual and what that means to us as a county and how we serve the residents of Hennepin County. And then we spent some time talking about inclusion. What did that really mean? How do we bring people into decision making and making the power spread on decision making and policies? And now we're at the point where we're talking about equity. And it seems to me that equity is the biggest part of all three words, yet we spent a little time talking about equity. So now we have a whole program around equity that I'll get to in a moment. But we started out with what we call a 3-tier leadership training program. And those classes included, the first one was called Little Things Mean a Lot. And that was basically to educate people on how the small things that they do, the micro equities, that they may be committing every day that they had no idea that they were doing. So we wanted to educate them about what that was and then give them some tools to help them first be aware of the micro inequities, and another word for micro inequities is microaggressions. We don't say microaggressions. The reason is that folks think that when you say microaggression that you're actually talking about an aggressive behavior. But most micro inequities are small little things that you do to make people feel unincluded. And so we wanted to make sure that people were thinking about those things, from rolling of the eyes to sighing to just not listening to a person or not inviting them, and then give them tools to be aware of when they were doing it and then what they could do not to do those behaviors. The second class was for our supervisors and up, and that was conducting non-biased interviews. We were doing a lot of work in our human resources department to make sure that our postings came with a D&I lens. And so we wanted to make sure that people who were interviewing people were interviewing with an awareness of their biases and then what to do with that, because we all have them. So we didn't want to tell people that they could get rid of them, but you can definitely control your biases and understand your biases, and then maybe even change your mind at some point about your biases. So that was the second part of the education. And then the last one was called intercultural conflict styles. And that was all about conflict. How do you handle conflict within different cultures? And that one comes with an assessment that people can take and then figure out how to have good communication with someone who might be from a different culture. And that class was really big, and a lot of people were interested in that. And I think we all learned a lot from those three classes. And then once we had people trained in those three things, then we brought in Advancing Racial Equity class. And this is a version of a class that's done through the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And we took their session and Hennepinized it, if you will. And we wanted to educate people about racism and the history of it and what it really meant. And now we're at the point where we're doing a racial equity impact tool that we developed also from GARE, and we Hennepinized that as well. And we're teaching people how to use that tool for anything that we do at the county. We can use this tool for. And because we're large and we have so many aspects of business at the county, we wanted to make sure that this tool could be universal. So anyone can take this tool and run any type of decision making that they're going to do through this tool to make sure that there's equity in the decisions. And sometimes when you think you have equity in decisions, you're not aware of things that may affect people in different ways that you don't even know about. So the tool helps you bring the right parties to the table. It makes you ask the right questions. It makes sure that the decision making is good for everyone and just not a couple of groups or one group. So that's what we're doing now. And then as Dan mentioned earlier, we're now doing a racial equity impact tool champion program. And the reason why we're doing that is because we want this tool to be used countywide. We want it to be used in the community. And so we felt like we needed some champions, people who had extra training on how to use the tool throughout the county that could go into another department or go into a community program or anywhere that we are in business with people and make sure that you had a tool champion that could help you work through the tool. The tool is just 6 questions, but those 6 questions could take you quite some time to get through. The first time I did it, I discovered that the first thing you do is you come up with more questions, right? So you come up with I came up with about 50 extra questions. The first time I read through it, and I thought, wow, this is going to take some time, but it makes you think about the data. It makes you think about the culture. It makes you think about all the things that you don't usually think about when you're making a decision. And then that makes you bring in other folks, which brings in the inclusiveness. And I'd be happy to talk about it more later, but that's sort of our journey for the last 3 years. And the other part of it is that the disparities reduction line of business is focusing on domains that I'll talk about a little bit later. So we're trying to reduce disparities in 7 different categories throughout the county.
You know, Tanya, if you want, it's okay to actually dig into the domains right now real quick, and then we need to pivot to Dr. Pastrano here pretty quickly, but why don't you just quickly give us a high-level flyover of those domains if we've got the graphic ready.
Sure. So the domains are education, employment, health, housing, income, justice, and transportation. And so what we did is we wanted everyone in the county to be involved. And so we have a department at the county that's called Center of Innovation. And what they did is they put a call out to people who wanted to work in these domains, who had a passion for it. And so each one of these domains now has a sponsor at the administrative level, and then they have a lead, and then they have a whole committee or community of people that works on each one of these domains. As you can see from the graphic, each domain has 3 main goals that they came up with, and then the ones that are highlighted are the ones that each domain is focusing on right now. So for instance, education is to improve school stability and consistency for youth involved in the county system. And so we have a person who is in charge of that, who is working on that, and they are doing great things in education for kids who are involved in the county system. They're making sure that they get computers, they're making sure that they have access to teachers, and getting the type of education at the level that they deserve as children, instead of getting a education that is lacking. We want to make sure that they will be productive citizens, and so they're getting that education. And so those are the 7 domains that we are really focusing on, while we are also educating our employees and all the training that we have. So we're doing lots of things simultaneously. Like I said, we have a new business line at the county that is focusing on this directly. So some of us work on this full-time, some of us work on it as part of our jobs where we work in other areas as well. So we have several hundred people who are working on this priority, and it is a big priority for our county administrator that I'm happy to say. And he sits on the governance board, and he makes sure that we're all moving in directions that are agreed upon. And we're doing this in a very equitable fashion, which usually is not the case when you're making business decisions. And so we're really happy. It's all new for us. So we're figuring out when we do something right, and we're figuring out when we make a mistake, and then we go back and do it again. But we're very proud of the work that we're doing, and we can see how the disparities are being reduced by running analytics. We have an analytics person that's devoted as well, and so we just make sure that we're keeping up with what's going on. And I'll turn it back over to you, Dan.
That's great, Tanya. And I'll just comment this this model here of the domains, and you can see them as like interlocking gears while holding the metaphor loosely. The bigger, deeper idea is if you move one, you actually move all of them. And
Right.
so if you're addressing education, as Tanya just mentioned, you're actually pivoting income. If you work on justice, it will actually have an impact on health. And it's sort of this really interconnected understanding, holistic understanding that is so important because nothing is done in isolation and everything is connected, everything else. It's really powerful. Well, we need to pivot to Dr. Ramon Pastrano. Take us into your deeper dive, Ramon. I mean, you're an expert in training and coaching on mental models related to cultural content, inside-out narrative. What are some high-level considerations for executive leaders to be aware of, and how can they ensure that as leaders that they remain on their own, our own individual journeys over the arc of our careers?
Yeah, well, thank you, Dan. Like you said, right, we are part of systems. Systems are not static. Systems are living organism, and we all are part of it, and we are all interconnected. So my approach to this work is a little bit further, back upstream, and it connects with what Shemaine and Tanya are talking about, but I start much earlier, right? So I like a quote by Bill O'Brien that says that the success of an intervention depends a great deal on the internal condition of the individual, right? So we need to tend to what is happening internally to each and every one of us. So the movement for me begins from ego to eco, from the internal to the external. And what is difficult for people, especially leaders, is to illuminate those blind spots, those places from where we operate on a regular basis. So we develop these ideas of what we call knowledge conversion tools. And knowledge conversion tools are experiences, are assessments, are customized training that we do with the goal of making the unconscious conscious, the implicit explicit, so that people, so that leader can see what is informing their decision making. So as we know, as adults, all of us, and as leaders, we have acquired a cohesive body of experiences, associations, concepts, values, beliefs, and conditioned responses. So those things become what we call frame of references or mental models. And these mental models define our life world. So these mental models also functions as the structure of assumption through which we understand our experiences and the realities of others. But they also selectively shape and delimit expectations, perceptions, cognitions, and feelings. And they also set our line of action. And once that line of action is set, we automatically move from one specific activity to the other. In other words, our unconscious brain, which is that contained most of our experiences, about 99.99996%, is the one making all the calculations, all the evaluations, and every decisions that we make. Our cognitive brain is the one that we're using right now, the one that we are engaged with. And this, particular, brain is what we call our slow brain, according to Kahneman, right? And our slow brain is only aware of what is happening in the moment. But we receive over 11 million bits of information, of data, every second, and we're only capable of processing 40. So how do we do that, right? So that's because our unconscious brain is doing most of the processing. So for that reason, we developed this tool. This came out of my research. We call the 4I model. And the 4I model focus in 4 dimensions of us. And the dance, as you can see in the slide, is from the ego to the eco. So the first question is who I am. It's about identity. And identity is not just understanding who you are, but it's an internal, an intentional and attentional process of self-discovery and self-awareness, understanding your gifts, your talents, your abilities, your biases, your preferences, and understanding how you make decisions. The connection to the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is that by understanding our own worldview and the way that we perceive the world and the map that we use, to understand the world in front of us, we can then understand how others are also seeing, their world and maintain their own reality. Integration is about who are those around me. What are the different, dimensions of diversity, the different cultures around us, the different dimensions of culture, as we attempt to enter into different spaces, and understanding that all spaces are different. So we need to understand context. Context here is very important. And the purpose here is that by understanding, the dimensions of culture, the dimensions of diversity, we're able to build better relationship with people. So now we were inside, in the ego by using our, by focusing on identity. Then we step out into integration. Now we go back to intrinsic motivation. So we go back internally. And this now is about understanding what is the motivation behind my behavior, what is fueling the way that I make decisions, what is informing my decision making. And that's where we focus on unconscious bias, understanding also other attending to lack of historical awareness. What happened when we don't have the right information, right? So our brain are now wired to perform in a way that can be optimal if we don't have the right information. So our brain are not wired to perceive what it doesn't know. So we don't know what we don't know, therefore our brains are helpless. And the last one is influence. And influence is now as a leader, understanding myself, understanding those around me, and understanding the places from where I'm operating. How do I create the condition where everybody around me can become the best version of themselves? And that particular process, and then the next slide, if I, Diane, if you can share that with me, Dana, is this process also that will help people understand how to transform systems and self. So as I shared with you at the beginning, I began with this idea of trying to shift the systemic conditions around people, soon to realize that that was not the best approach. I needed to help people understand themselves better so that then they can shift the conditions around them. This particular model came from Harvard Business Review, which I really appreciate. It's called PRESS. And PRESS it's about 3 questions that we need to ask. The first question is about condition, right? Do I understand what the problem is and where it comes from? So it's about problem awareness and root cause analysis. Most of the time we understand the problem at the surface level, but we don't understand that there are so many different levels of complexity that are fueling that problem. So for equity, this is really critical, that we're able to understand, right, what are the system disconnect, the personal limitations that are creating everything that we are seeing bubble up at the surface. The next question is about concern. And this is where why I started doing this work. Do I care enough about the problem? But do I care enough about the people that are being harmed by that problem? And this is about empathy. This is about love. Do you care enough about the people to tackle that problem? And the last one is about correction. Do I know how to correct the problem? And if I know how to correct the problem, am I willing to do it? Am I willing to do whatever it takes to correct the problem? And this is where sacrifice comes into place. And this is a word that's almost is becoming foreign, to many of us. And in leadership, sacrifice is huge. Sacrifice can be the difference between successful transformational leadership or transactional leadership. So as I look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, equity, like Tanya said, is key, right? I call equity the science of system thinking, the ability to understand how systems are behaving so that we then can attend to the disconnect, the personal limitation, and create, a path of equal access and opportunity for people. And that require in-depth level of understanding how systems behave and using critical thinking analysis. So when we work with leaders and with organization, everything is around this particular 4I model. Is, you know, the dance between the ego and the ego and the ego going back and forth.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Pastrano. And for the remainder of our time, I want to pivot back to Shemaine, but then we can really sort of open this up across all three of you. But I'm going to sort of move into a few things that I heard all three of you talk about. Shemaine, one of the things you mentioned was empathy. Obviously, that was at the center of Dr. Pastrano's piece. And I do want to draw Ramon out a little bit on like that corrective piece, or all of you on the corrective piece. I mean, I feel like in the business world, and especially when we have horrific years like this year, and our consciousness is sort of awakened, and as a white leader, deeply awakened, empathy's pretty close, and it comes here. What sort of surrounds that? Then how do we move from empathy to action? So Shemaine, in a corporate environment, Target, how do you, I mean, it feels like we're at the empathy stage, although that will burn off as time moves on, and kind of, I don't know, we assume we get vaccinated and we're sort of out of crisis. How do we move empathy to action is, I guess, the question. We'll start with Shemaine, and then we can bounce it around if we want to.
Absolutely, and I'll be really eager to hear Dr. Pastrano's thoughts on this as well. But I think it's a really fair question, and one that certainly I and my peers and colleagues at Target have been considering and thinking through. You know, one of the things that I mentioned early on in my introduction was how far away sometimes our communities can seem. And while I experienced that as a child on the East Coast, I think it's certainly applicable here in the Twin Cities, where even though there is tremendous amounts of curiosity, a desire to learn and grow, folks are reading things that perhaps they hadn't been reading before and engaging in dialogue and conversations that they may not have engaged in before. It's really difficult to do this work and learn exactly what you need to do and how to show up in this work from a book or from a film or from an article. And one of the biggest challenges that I think we face here in the Twin Cities is that our communities are geographically very far apart and separated, segregated, and our lives are not necessarily intertwined. And I think one of the unique benefits of both a workplace setting, corporations, but other organizations as well, and the technology that's been enabled by the current sort of pandemic conditions that we're in, is that we actually are finding those intersections across our lives and across our homes in ways that perhaps we might not have in the past, that can perhaps open that door of moving from empathy to action. I think the other piece too, though, is very similar to something that really sparked for me in Dr. Pastrano's model, which is this idea of, do I care enough about the problem, and am I willing to sacrifice in order to do something about it? I think those are two important but very distinct questions. And the first is probably something that most people would answer yes to. I think that second question around sacrifice is one that our both local community but also broader community is really grappling with now, as we think about what do we need to do differently than perhaps we might have in the past, and what does that mean, even as how do we push past the fear of what we might lose or what might be normal to us, to move into a space that's new and different in order to move to action. So I think that sacrifice really is a piece of the puzzle that we haven't quite unlocked, but I think is really an important consideration as we think about that question around empathy.
Excellent. Tanya or Ramon, do you want to respond to that as well?
Certainly. Thank you, Shemaine. So I always consider, empathy and love are, the highest form of emotional intelligence. Not only the highest form of emotional intelligence, but the only emotion that can span intelligence as well. When you look at, empathy, which is the ability to look and to feel and connect with other people at the heart, is also another bridge, another way into becoming more cultural competent, right? You're not only seeing life through your own ethnocentric eyes, but now you are seeing life through other people's eyes as well. And now you have a better vision. Now you're looking from multiple perspectives, and that can lead you into becoming more cultural competent. So when I talk with leaders, this idea of love and empathy may feel a little bit soft, for people, but they're not. They're very powerful tool to really create transformational environment where people can become the best version of themselves. So I tell leaders, followers usually are concerned with 4 things. Number 1 is, do you know? Do you have acumen? Second, do you know where you're going? Third, can you take me there? And last one is, will you take care of, about me along the way? And that is, it looks like something very simple, but that's something that we can, offer to those that are willing to, to follow us.
That's really interesting. Yeah, the word love doesn't always translate well into our marketplace. We don't have the Department of Love. We don't have the staff, it sort of gets a little bit diffuse. I will comment, some language I've been using in the marketplace is seeing the humanity of everyone and sort of connected to all of us. I had a recent conversation about George Floyd deal from a family member related to someone who works and they live in Dassel, and they just couldn't put together the pieces. And because it relates to the police department, I had to work through this set of conversations, many questions and framing and distance and relationship, and help everyone to differentiate and see the humanity, not just get caught in some of the weeds that sometimes become defenses to actually working on the harder issue. I am curious, Tanya, please speak to the topic as you want to, but also because you've been emphasizing equity, and I just feels like inclusion is sort of the bigger phrase right now, and you want to focus on equity. If you want to speak to this other topic, that's fine too, but I'm curious in drawing out why the emphasis on equity and why is that sort of a point of emphasis? You can speak to both questions if you want.
Sure. In one of our classes, we make sure that we talk about empathy versus sympathy. We want to make sure that people understand the difference between empathy and sympathy. Most of the clients that we serve that come to the county do not want sympathy. They want to be able to live their lives as prosperous as possible, and they may happen to need a little help. And that means that our workers have to understand empathy and not sympathy. And so we do stress the understanding of empathy and try to put yourself in that person's place. We use an example of people living in poverty, and they're unable to make certain decisions that we seem to be able to make quite easily. For instance, if you have to decide between your child going to school or you going to work or getting food, how do you make that decision? Most of us don't have to make those type of decisions. And so you have to have a lens of empathy to help the person work through those decisions. So if we require them to fill out paperwork or fill out forms, are they able to do that on the schedule that they have? And so we had to make sure that our workers understood that you have to have some empathy to understand their thought pattern versus us just telling them what they have to do. So that's what I'll say about empathy. I'm sorry, Dan, what was the second part of the question?
It was just really asking your emphasis on equity.
Oh, yeah.
By the way, that distinction between sympathy and empathy is wonderful.
Yes.
So equity, and this is,
Yeah.
I guess, more of a technical thing. This
Right.
to you feels like a really important piece of what you're measuring. I just wanted to draw you out a little bit on that.
So when the county administrator decided that we were going to have a new business line called disparities reduction, it was important that we understood as county employees that we understood how to get to the point of equity. So, you've seen the photos out there of people standing on blocks trying to watch a baseball game and how to get equity so everyone has an equal view and that sort of thing. And to me, that just wasn't enough information for people to get to the point of making decisions about equity. What I found is that people were making decisions in a small little huddle or a small little box that they thought that they could make an equitable decision. But going back to the empathy thing, if you can't understand another person's point of view or their train of thought or how they make decisions, how can you make policies that are equitable for the community if you can't see their side of it or their point of view of it? So I felt like we needed a tool to help us do that because it just doesn't come naturally. We all are educated. We all think we know what's best, right? But we don't always know those things. And so we needed a tool to help us do that. And once you start using the tool, you get a more understanding of, wow, I would have never thought of that myself, right? And so we need, if we're going to get equitable situations in those 7 domains, we have to first understand what equity is and how to do it. And I think if we get equity, inclusion will follow and diversity will follow. And so right now, the focus for me is on equity because I think that encompasses diversity and inclusion. And I'm hoping, I hope Dr. Roman agrees with me. I'd love to hear his point of view on that. But you know, that's where I'm going right now with it.
Ping pong ball has just bounced over to Dr. Pastrano.
No, I totally agree. Agree with Tanya, but I see it almost in a circle. They are closely interrelated, right? So diversity, equity, inclusion, and to me, the one ingredient that sometimes is missing is cultural competence. Cultural competence is the 3rd most necessary skills to survive and to lead in the 21st century. And you cannot do critical thinking or system thinking without cultural competence. So when I look at, if you want to use, convergence, circles, you have diversity, you have equity, you have inclusion, and you have cultural competence. And at the center of that is where the best possibility for belonging can happen. So a lot of people are using belonging. But Tanya, going back to your, original comment, one thing that Tanya said at the beginning that is remarkably very, important for us to understand is this idea that we are talking about all these terminologies on a daily basis, and we do not have shared meaning. We do not have shared meaning. And I think it will be important to, for organizations, for people to begin to get a hold of their, of the language, of this work by really understanding and gaining shared meanings or defining those terms for the organization rather than, keeping them loose and then, not having a control of their own narrative.
Yeah, thank you. Well, friends, it's 11:57 and we need to wrap up. And so I would invite you to just in like a minute or less, any final thoughts that you have. And I guess before the final sign off, I just want to say thank you. You are really brilliant in the areas that you work. You're incredible humans, incredible leaders. You're a gift to downtown. You're a gift to the Twin Cities and the state. And your time is so valuable, and we're grateful you invested it in the downtown business community. And so any final thoughts or words before we sign off? And why don't we kind of go in the order with which we started? So Shemaine, back to you first.
And I think I would just close with tremendous gratitude to be a part of this conversation and the hope that this continues to be the dialogue that we engage in as a community, that this is sort of the space we're sitting now continues to be the norm as we think about how we align on common language, drive for equity, and really change the landscape when we think about inclusion for our organization and for our community. So just incredibly grateful to be a part of today's conversation.
Thank you so much. Tanya, any concluding thoughts?
I'd just like to thank everyone for the conversation. Charmaine and Dr. Ramon, I've learned so much from you all too, so thank you very much. Dan, thank you for inviting me. Hennepin County is in the business of serving the community, so if anyone has suggestions for us or comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tanya. And then Dr. Pastrano, any final words?
Yeah, well, we know that culture is dynamic, non-linear, always evolving, always changing. So therefore, there's no finish line. And like Tanya said, we need each other. Nobody's going to arrive at the finish line first. And if you arrive at the finish line first, there's no finish line. That means, that there are other being, left behind. So this work, again, we need to pay attention to ourselves internally. We may not have historical awareness, but we are responsible for the assumptions that we make, especially those that create some of the disparities that Tonya was talking about. Deeply grateful to Shemaine, Tonya, to Dan, to Kramer, and also to the group, from MDC for the work that you're doing and the leadership that you're providing. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And as we get ready to sign off, this whole idea of the journey of cultural comedy, I just will invite everyone to consider it's your journey first. That whole internal conversation is where it begins. And I appreciate Ramon's last comments that it never ends. You don't stop doing this in order for us to be a more complete marketplace, a more complete society that thrives and grows and benefits all of our citizens. Thank you to everybody who's participated in this forum, whether it's live or watching it now as it lives on in the web. On behalf of the Minneapolis Downtown Council, but also the Easttown Business Partnership and New Loop Partners, the groups I work for as Director of Downtown Partnerships, the staff of the Downtown Council who helped produce this event, Steve Kramer, Dana Grady, and Mary Beth Weisberg, we are grateful for your participation. We're grateful for your engagement in making downtown a compelling, thrilling and exciting and inclusive space to work, to live, to recreate, and to just be. And participation in forums like this help us continue to move that arc into its fullness. Have a fantastic day. Take care, and we'll see you soon.